A red sun was setting over Ouagadougou, casting a haunting glow on the crowded streets where children had spent the afternoon kicking a worn soccer ball. That evening, the laughter stopped. Sirens screamed through the city. Mothers rushed to gather their children. Fathers pulled metal gates shut. An old man at the corner of a marketplace gripped his prayer beads tightly, whispering words of faith as armored vehicles rumbled past. On that night, something more than fear was in the air. Something historic was about to happen in Burkina Faso. For more than half a century, this small, landlocked nation in the Sahel has lived under the shadow of exploitation and terror. Foreign companies stripped its gold and resources, while extremist violence tore through its villages. Ordinary citizens have carried the heaviest burden. A mother in Djibo, wondering if her children will return from school. A farmer in Kaya who buried 2 sons lost to attacks. A shopkeeper in Ouagadougou, watching her business collapse because customers no longer feel safe to walk the streets. For them, survival is not an abstract idea. It is a daily struggle. In the center of this storm now stands a man barely in his mid-30s, Captain Ibrahim Traoré. To some, he is a bold young soldier sent by destiny to reclaim Burkina Faso's dignity. To others, he is a reckless leader risking his nation's fragile stability. His decision to arrest foreign mining executives, men once thought untouchable, was a shock to the world. It was the kind of moment that made the streets erupt with both cheers and whispers. Was this the beginning of justice, or the spark of even greater retaliation from powerful nations unwilling to lose control? Americans who remember the tension of the Cold War know this feeling, the sense that the fate of millions can turn on the choice of a single leader. And that is the very question confronting Burkina Faso today. Is Traoré the man who can protect his people? Or will his defiance unleash consequences beyond what this fragile nation can endure? If you have ever lived through a moment when history seemed to hold its breath, think carefully now. Perhaps God is testing Burkina Faso. Perhaps the story unfolding here will shape not only Africa's tomorrow, but the world's. The night that changed Burkina Faso did not come out of nowhere. For weeks, signs had been building. Troop movements, quiet rumors in the markets, whispers inside government buildings. But when the arrests began, the speed and precision shocked even seasoned observers. In a carefully coordinated operation, the government of Ibrahim Traoré targeted some of the most powerful foreign mining executives in the country. These were not minor players. They were men with private jets, international connections, and influence that had once seemed untouchable. Yet in a single night, they were taken from luxury compounds and flown under heavy guard to military facilities. The charges were clear: years of illegal exploitation of Burkina Faso's mineral wealth, billions siphoned away while the country's children went hungry, and its hospitals lacked basic supplies. To many ordinary Burkinabés, the images of these men in handcuffs felt like justice long overdue. But for others, the sudden move raised fears of retaliation from the countries that backed these companies. Would Burkina Faso face sanctions? Would foreign troops intervene? To understand why this was such a turning point, one must remember the deep scars of the past. For decades, Burkina Faso's gold, uranium, and other minerals have been shipped overseas, while the profits rarely stayed behind. Villages near the mines tell a bitter story. A farmer named Musa, whose land lies near one of the largest sites, described how his crops withered when water sources were polluted. "They took the gold," he said, "and left us with dust." His oldest son left for the city in search of work, only to be killed in an extremist attack on a bus. For Musa, the arrests of the mining executives carried a meaning far beyond politics. "Maybe now," he whispered, "our children will not die for nothing." The operation itself involved thousands of soldiers. Convoys rolled across dusty highways, helicopters hovered low over mining zones, and checkpoints sealed off entire districts. Reports indicated that advanced weapons supplied through new military alliances were deployed, including armored personnel carriers and drones for surveillance. The scale was unprecedented in recent history. Traoré himself, dressed in full military uniform, was seen at command posts giving direct orders, a deliberate move to signal that he was in control. In the capital, Ouagadougou, the atmosphere was electric. Crowds gathered in front of government buildings, waving national flags and chanting Traoré's name. Some called him a hero, others a savior. Yet beneath the cheers there was unease. Shopkeepers whispered about whether international companies would shut down operations entirely, leaving thousands unemployed. Parents worried about food prices, already rising after years of instability. International observers quickly picked up on the symbolic weight of the arrests. For Africa, this was more than a local event. It was a challenge to a system that had lasted half a century, where foreign powers dictated the terms of resource extraction. For the West, it was a message that Burkina Faso would no longer play by old rules. And for the Burkinabe people themselves, it was both a moment of pride and a moment of fear. This duality, hope on one side, anxiety on the other, was visible everywhere. In one neighborhood, a group of young men lit candles in the street, declaring the beginning of a new dawn. Just a few miles away, a mother of 3 stood in line at a bread stall, shaking her head. "I want to believe in Traoré," she said, "but my children cannot eat speeches. They need food." The main event was not just about arrests. It was about symbolism. For the first time in living memory, the powerful were held accountable on Burkinabe soil. And yet the very scale of the action raised questions. Could a country already facing terrorist attacks on multiple fronts survive the backlash of challenging global giants? Could a young leader, untested on the world stage, carry the weight of such a gamble? And that leads us to the question every Burkinabe, and indeed every observer around the world, was asking in the aftermath, but what exactly triggered this dramatic turning point? What pushed Traoré to take this risk now, at this moment in history? The climax came when Captain Ibrahim Traoré stepped before the cameras. His face was calm, his voice steady, but his words sent shockwaves across Burkina Faso and far beyond. "Our resources," he declared, "belong to our people. No longer will outsiders decide our destiny." It was not just a speech, it was a declaration of independence in real time. For many who watched on battered televisions or crowded around radios, it was the moment they had been waiting for their entire lives. In Ouagadougou, the streets erupted. Thousands gathered, waving flags, chanting his name, and singing old patriotic songs that had not been heard for decades. Older men wept openly, saying they had never believed they would live to see such a day. One retired schoolteacher said, "For 50 years, we taught our children to endure. Now, maybe we can teach them to stand." Yet not everyone celebrated. In quiet corners of the capital, business owners feared that foreign investment would vanish overnight. A young shopkeeper worried that sanctions might close the borders, raising prices for food and fuel. "I want to believe in him," she said, pointing to a photograph of Traoré on the wall. "But I also need to feed my family tomorrow." That tension, the clash of hope and fear, was written on every face in the city. The high point of emotion came during a spontaneous rally outside the National Assembly. As Traoré's convoy passed, the crowd surged forward. Women held babies aloft, as if to present them to the young leader. Men raised fists in solidarity. Some knelt in prayer. The symbolism was unmistakable. The people were investing their trust, their faith, even their survival in this one man. For a population long abandoned by corrupt politicians, it felt like a second chance at dignity. But the military's actions did not stop at symbolic arrests. Reports surfaced of mines being seized by state security forces, with workers ordered to continue operations under government supervision. Pictures leaked of sealed warehouses stacked with gold bars, guarded by soldiers in desert camouflage. For some, these images were proof that Burkina Faso was finally reclaiming what was rightfully its own. For others, they were a chilling reminder of how quickly power can shift and how dangerous it can become. The international community reacted with alarm. Western embassies issued warnings to their citizens. Foreign media described the events as a radical power grab. But in the streets of Ouagadougou, ordinary Burkinabe did not see radicalism. They saw justice. For a farmer named Adama, who lost his brother in an extremist ambush while trucks full of gold drove safely to foreign ports, the sight of foreign executives in handcuffs was deeply personal. "My brother's blood fed their wealth," he said quietly. Now at least someone is paying the price. Inside government halls, the atmosphere was electric. Ministers and military commanders pledged loyalty to Traoré, while younger officers spoke of building a new Africa free from dependence on the West. At one press conference, a senior official declared, "Burkina Faso will no longer kneel." The words reverberated across the continent, drawing praise from some African leaders and sharp warnings from others. And yet, amid all the euphoria, there was an undercurrent of dread. Everyone knew that powerful nations do not surrender influence without a fight. Would there be sanctions? Would there be covert operations aimed at destabilizing Traoré's government? Would terrorist groups, many of them armed and funded from abroad, increase their attacks? These questions hung heavily in the air, unspoken but unavoidable. The climax of that night, the speech, the arrests, the surge of emotion, was unforgettable. It was the kind of moment that defines a generation. But even as the crowd roared with approval, one question lingered on every lip, from the markets of Ouagadougou to the villages of the north. Will the world act swiftly to crush this bold defiance? Or will Burkina Faso finally be allowed to stand on its own? The morning after the arrests, life in Burkina Faso looked both familiar and strangely transformed. On the surface, the same daily struggles continued. Families lining up for bread, farmers heading to their fields, children weaving through traffic on their way to school. Yet, beneath that routine was a sense that the nation had crossed a line from which there was no turning back. For better or worse, the people knew they were living in a new chapter of history. For ordinary citizens, the consequences were immediate. Markets in Ouagadougou saw prices fluctuate wildly, as traders feared border closures or international sanctions. A father of four, waiting in line at a gas station, described the anxiety that gripped him. "We cheer for justice," he said, "but how will I buy fuel if the world cuts us off?" His words echoed the fears of countless families who, while proud of Traoré's boldness, worried about whether they could afford food and medicine tomorrow. In rural areas, the effects were even starker. Villages near mining zones reported sudden disruptions as foreign staff fled the country. Some mines were placed under military supervision, and local workers were told their jobs were secure. Yet few trusted such assurances. A young miner in Houndé admitted he was torn. "I am proud our leader stood up," he said, "but I also know my wages feed my children. If the mines close, what then?" His face revealed the difficult trade-off between national pride and personal survival. Politically, the arrests shook the balance of power in the Sahel region. Burkina Faso, already facing years of insurgent violence, suddenly found itself isolated from some Western partners but embraced by others in Africa who admired Traoré's defiance. Regional alliances began to shift. Neighboring governments debated whether to follow Burkina Faso's example or distance themselves to avoid angering global powers. The African Union released cautious statements, reflecting both admiration and concern. Inside the country, the political atmosphere hardened. Supporters of Traoré celebrated him as the embodiment of sovereignty. Streets were decorated with murals of his image, and chants of his name echoed in university campuses. But opposition voices warned of the dangers of concentrating power in the hands of a young soldier. "Revolutions inspire hope," one former politician said, "but they can also consume their own children." His warning, though quiet, resonated with older Burkinabe who had seen uprisings before turn into long years of disappointment. The humanitarian consequences were also impossible to ignore. Reports showed that more than 2 million Burkinabe were already displaced by violence before the arrests took place. Aid organizations worried that international backlash might reduce funding and worsen the crisis. Families already living in makeshift camps feared they might be forgotten entirely if global attention shifted to political drama. A mother of 3, living in a tent outside Kaya, summed it up painfully. "They talk about gold and power. We talk about rice and water." International investors reacted swiftly. Several mining companies announced suspensions of operations, citing security concerns. This fueled job losses and threatened the government's ability to fund social programs. At the same time, some Burkinabe intellectuals argued that short-term hardship was the necessary price of reclaiming independence. A university professor in Ouagadougou compared the moment to America's own revolutionary struggle. "Freedom," he said, "has never been won without sacrifice." Amid the uncertainty, there was one undeniable reality. The people were divided between hope and fear. On one side, jubilant crowds who saw Traoré as a symbol of justice. On the other, quiet households calculating how many days their food would last if sanctions took hold. This split reflected the very soul of the nation, proud yet vulnerable, defiant yet dependent. And through it all, the central question loomed larger with every passing day. If Burkina Faso has dared to reclaim its resources, will it now pay the price in blood, poverty, and isolation? Or will this act of defiance ignite a broader African awakening? The answer, many believed, would depend not only on Traoré's leadership, but on how the United States and the world chose to respond. But what exactly will America do in the face of this defiance? The shockwaves from Burkina Faso's bold move did not stop at its borders. Within hours of the arrests, reactions began to pour in from capitals around the world. And while the streets of Ouagadougou pulsed with energy and hope, boardrooms, embassies, and newsrooms in Washington, Paris, London, and Brussels were filled with unease. Across Africa, leaders faced a dilemma. Some praised Traoré's defiance, framing it as the beginning of a long-overdue reckoning with foreign exploitation. In Bamako, officials sympathetic to Burkina Faso's stance called it a message to the world that Africa is not for sale. In Accra and Dakar, however, politicians worried about the precedent. If foreign investors pulled out in fear, would the entire region suffer economically? A Nigerian analyst put it simply, "The question is not just about Burkina Faso. It is about whether Africa will reclaim its house or burn it down in the process." Europe's reaction was more straightforward. Mining conglomerates with billions invested in Burkina Faso lobbied their governments fiercely. In Paris, executives warned of serious consequences if African leaders followed Traoré's example. French media, still grappling with France's colonial legacy in West Africa, painted the arrests as reckless and destabilizing. Brussels issued formal statements about the need for rule of law and investor confidence. Yet, few ordinary Burkinabe missed the irony. Where were those concerns about the rule of law when foreign companies exploited their resources unchecked for decades? Then came Washington. For the United States, Burkina Faso is more than just a country rich in gold and uranium. It is part of the Sahel, one of the most fragile regions in the world, where terrorism has thrived in recent years. American policymakers understand that instability in Burkina Faso does not stay confined. It spreads across borders, empowering extremist groups and creating refugee flows that destabilize entire continents. To put it plainly, what happens in Ouagadougou matters in Washington. Behind closed doors, U.S. officials debated their options. Sanctions were discussed, but so were warnings that isolating Traoré might push him into the arms of powers hostile to the United States. Intelligence analysts pointed out that Russia and China were watching closely, ready to step in with offers of aid, weapons, and political support. The nightmare scenario for Washington was clear. A Burkina Faso aligned with America's rivals, sitting on critical mineral wealth and positioned at the center of the Sahel's security crisis. Public opinion in the United States reflected a broader fatigue. Many Americans, especially older citizens who had lived through Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan, were skeptical of new foreign entanglements. "We don't need another endless war," one veteran said during a televised call-in show. "But we can't ignore it either, because chaos over there eventually reaches our shores." That tension between staying out and stepping in has long shaped America's foreign policy debates. A retired U.S. general interviewed on national television was blunt. "If Burkina Faso collapses, the Sahel collapses. And if the Sahel collapses, extremist groups gain ground. That's not just Africa's problem. That's America's problem." His words carried weight, especially for older viewers who remembered how seemingly distant conflicts once pulled the United States into costly commitments. The media coverage in America also reflected the split. Some outlets portrayed Traoré as a dangerous populist, gambling with his country's future. Others framed him as a young nationalist, standing up for dignity in the face of exploitation. Talk radio shows lit up with callers debating whether the United States should view Traoré as a partner or an adversary. For many Americans hearing his name for the first time, the question was unsettling. Could the fate of global stability hinge on a 36-year-old captain from a country few had ever visited? And then there was the question of values. For an older American audience, the story struck chords of faith, justice, and family. The idea of a nation reclaiming its dignity, even at great cost, resonated with those who had lived through moments of national struggle. Yet so too did the fear of what happens when bold gestures clash with harsh geopolitical realities. Could Burkina Faso endure the pressure that was surely coming? Would ordinary families pay the heaviest price? This is where America's role becomes decisive. If Washington chooses confrontation, Burkina Faso could spiral into isolation, sanctions, and deeper poverty. If it chooses engagement, there may be room to stabilize the nation while respecting its sovereignty. But there is no guarantee either path will succeed. And so the cliffhanger remains, not just for Burkina Faso, but for the world. Is this the birth of a new African independence that the United States must learn to respect, or the spark of a crisis that will demand American intervention, whether it wants to or not? The events in Burkina Faso are not just about one night of arrests or one young leader's bold gamble. They are about the fragile balance of a nation already scarred by decades of exploitation, terrorism, and poverty. And as history has shown, when balance is lost in the Sahel, the consequences do not remain within Africa. They ripple across oceans, touching Europe, America, and the wider world. The warning signs are already clear. Aid organizations say over 2 million Burkinabe are displaced. Food prices are rising in markets where families already struggle to buy bread. If sanctions tighten or investors withdraw, hardship will deepen. And if extremist groups sense weakness, they will strike harder, driving more civilians from their homes. The danger is not simply instability, it is a humanitarian crisis that could spread across borders. At the same time, political pressure is building. Traoré has inspired admiration across Africa, but admiration does not guarantee survival. Unless he secures alliances and stabilizes the economy, his leadership may falter. And if global powers decide to intervene, whether openly or in the shadows, Burkina Faso could become the center of another proxy conflict. Here is the sobering prediction. If the African military alliance that supports Burkina Faso does not strengthen itself within the next 3 months, the nation may find itself dangerously alone. And alone, Burkina Faso could be forced into choices that test the very survival of its government and its people. So we end with the question that matters most. Is Ibrahim Traoré the hope of Africa's renewal, or the spark of another cycle of chaos? For those watching from America, this story is not far away. It is about justice, dignity, and whether small nations have the right to stand on their own without being crushed by larger powers. It is about whether families, like yours and mine, can live in peace, free from fear, free from exploitation. And so, I leave you with this thought. If you believe that freedom and faith still matter, let your heart respond. Share what you feel. Speak what you believe. Because silence, too, is a choice. If this story has stirred you, hold it close. For in the struggles of Burkina Faso, we may hear echoes of our own past, and perhaps a call from God to never stop defending the dignity of every people. May God bless Africa, the land of strength, hope, and unbroken will.